This is a behind the scenes of the creation of a liturgical art installation that I did at Grace Episcopal Church in Ocala, Florida for Pentecost in 2021 with dozens of people from the church. Actually, that's the end result of what it looked like, but it actually started out with figuring out how to do this origami. I had done years earlier a piece for Pentecost that was just tulle fabric, and we used that in this as well, but I wanted the flames of Pentecost to kind of rest above the congregation, and I figured the easiest way to create little flames was to do it with pieces of colored paper through origami. Now, since I hadn't done origami before, I kind of had to learn that process, and here I am folding the pieces. It probably would have been helpful to have this part of the video for the people who were folding, because the directions that I had from a book had some illustrations that were somewhat helpful, but it took a little while and you had some misshapen ones here and there. But since the typical color of the season of Pentecost is red, we definitely had red in there too, but what we ended up using was red, orange, and yellow, and I used regular origami paper just to figure out how I wanted to do the folds, because they weren't supposed to look like an animal or anything. They were just supposed to be shapes that could then be configured into kind of abstract forms of a flame. And after I figured out how I wanted that to work, I just went to an office supply store and got regular colored copy paper. So it's very easy. You don't have to have just regular origami paper for this, and then figured out the folding, and then handed out a packet with these illustrations as a guide, and about maybe 15 to 20 pieces of paper saying which need to be folded which way. And so people from different families in the church worked on that separately and then dropped them off back at the church. And once I had all of those folded pieces in the variations of the red, yellow, and orange, I glued them together in different configurations of that so that there would be some variety. And you'll see that coming up here, them getting glued together. Once those were all glued, I had some of the volunteers actually take a monofilament invisible thread with a needle and go through the top of each of the little flame shapes, so that there would be two on either end of a piece of thread. In the past, we have done an Advent project that uses stars, and there would be several stars on each thread hanging down, and they easily would get tangled up in each other as we placed them on fishing line going from one side of the sanctuary to the other. I wanted to avoid that this time, so I figured if we only had two in each grouping, that we could just flip one over the fishing line that was going across, one end of it over, and flip it over a couple times. It actually kept them in place very well, and nothing really got tangled up too much. So that was a new way of doing this that made this a little bit easier, and you will see those getting put in place coming up here. But yeah, gluing them together in these different configurations gave a little bit of variety. Some were bigger, some were smaller. There's also variations in the types of yellow and orange. The red's all the same, but the yellows and the oranges, there's some differences there, which just made it more interesting to look at overall. Now, the day before we set everything up and kind of hung these over is when the tulle had been placed there, and you can see me here the next morning trimming off the excess off the bottom to make it a little more flame-like, so it wasn't a blunt cut, but also because it was hanging down far too low and we have candles and people walking through there, so it needed to be up over their heads. Now, originally I had planned for the tulle to go up higher and to be attached just to the rafters, but the extension ladder that we've used in the past, we didn't have that day, and so we had to configure something else. And what I had planned to do was to glue with hot glue the sheets of the tulle onto pieces of lattice with some holes that were already drilled into them. And then when we would take the extension ladder up to the rafters, I would just tack through those holes with a nail and everything would be fine. So we had everything glued together and it was ready to go, but it wasn't gonna fit in the same way. It wasn't gonna be able to go up that high. So since we're already going to be using fishing line to go across the church, kind of horizontally, we had that fishing line there, and we decided to use those holes that were already pre-drilled to tie the fishing line onto this little structure, which was a little shaky, but it was sturdy enough to work. And then we hoisted it up over the top of the fishing line itself, not the actual tool, but we hoisted it up over the top of one of the rafters. It didn't come down as far as, or it came down further than what I had planned. It wasn't right on top of the rafters, so there's about maybe 18 inches that there was a gap. But if you hadn't known that that was my plan, then you wouldn't have known any different, and it looked fine. That was also why it was a little bit longer, because it was a foot and a half lower than I had originally anticipated. So I had to make this trimming first before we start in on hanging the flames. And you'll also see some long pieces as the volunteers come in to help me put it all together that are hanging down. That's almost like a tulle ribbon, and this was the first time that I had used that, and it will come down over the aisle. So we take this large step ladder, and special thanks to Philip Vincent, who was the one who volunteered to go up on the ladder all the time. And so here you see him taking the little flames that are on the strings and just flipping one end over one or two times, and really they stayed in place pretty well with that. So I don't know how many pairs of those we had, but we probably went back 5 or 6 rows in the pews within the church of these lengths of the fishing line, which you can't see any of the thread or the fishing line in these images, which is good because they were supposed to seem somewhat invisible. So it takes a little while. I think it took us maybe 3 hours to do all of this. It took longer to get the tool in place the day before because we did not have everything quite the way that we wanted it. But it would be put a few up, flip them over there, and then move the ladder into a different spot and do it some more, and try not to get tangled up in all the tool that was coming off of there. But the process really did go fairly quickly. Taking it down went even quicker. It was only about a half hour to take everything down. What I found was it was just easier to trim off all of the line, the fishing line and the thread, and then we still have the little flames if we want to use them again, and all of the tool as well, but we didn't need to keep lengths of thread with all of that on there because that was just going to be a pain. So here you can kind of see that the ribbon of tulle is coming from the top of the configuration where the tulle is attached up at the top, and it will kind of dip down in valleys. It'll have like little peaks and valleys, so it goes over the fishing line that is strung in between the two sides of the church. I thought it would just hang there okay on its own, but what we found is it wasn't hanging low enough in the valley area to have enough probably weight to keep it from slipping, so it kind of kept pulling itself back out. So we just looped it over once, kind of like we were doing with the flames, and that held it in place enough, and actually helped us to position things more the way that we wanted. So we kind of alternate. There's 2 red ribbons coming out and 2 orange ribbons, and they alternated as to which one was making a peak and which one was making a valley in what area. But yes, I can't really say enough of thanks to the volunteers because they really helped get all of this done. It looks like I'm standing around and just telling people what to do most of the time, but getting things in place, it was a lot of work to do all of that. You can see everything kind of shifting and moving around there when you hit one of those lines. the flames kind of all dance around. The same thing happens with the air conditioning, which was really nice to be able to see, particularly on Pentecost Sunday, that you could see everything kind of moving around like that. And we had baptisms on that day, so there were children looking up, it was right over their heads, and just kind of a nice effect there. So here we again are putting those lines or ribbons of tulle across the fishing line that is going across the church. So that was most of it in there, of putting it together. And here's some different views from the side. It looks like vastly different, but you get a better idea of how it is kind of just like floating up around underneath those rafters. You get some of the color in there a little bit better, and of course it changes at different times of the day and how much lighting is on. And so here was the procession going up on Pentecost Sunday, and then we have a shot here also of the gospel reading out in the midst of the congregation there, and this kind of floating over the heads of the congregation.